So welcome everyone. Thanks everybody for coming. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinongton nations here in London. And I'd like to encourage everybody to visit the website indigenous.uwo.ca to see all of the amazing work by our Indigenous scholars at Western, who are always working towards the public good. And you can see the amazing work they do and also the amazing spaces that we have on campus, which you're also encouraged to visit. So please do check that out. I'm very privileged to welcome Dr. Jennifer Simpson here this evening to speak to us. Jennifer is well known for her role that she's played at TMU in administration, in particular as a member of the chair of the University Renaming Committee. But her commitment to equity and scholarship goes back much, much further than that. She has worked in communications with a focus on equity and the obligations of universities to do the public good for over 3 decades. And she brings so much wisdom about the role of universities and how we can do things in a better way that I was really grateful that she agreed to make the trek down from Toronto to speak with us on this occasion for our public lecture series. I think I'm really excited to hear her viewpoint, which is going to focus, I think, a little bit more on teaching, which is something that we haven't addressed so much. So we've been talking a lot about research, which I think is valuable, but I'm really grateful that you're bringing that perspective about teaching as well, because they're not things that really separate well in the world of universities. So, like, everybody to please welcome Dr. Simpson.
So it's really good to be here. Thanks, Dan, for the introduction, and thanks all of you for coming out. It's great to be in conversation about these issues. I also want to thank Kate and Alyssa. Alyssa was an early person in the conversation, and I'm sure there are other colleagues in the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. And also, I'm sure there's folks at the library who helped set this up, so I don't know their names, but thank you for the people at the library. And I'll mention one other name, Ella Parker Tam, who is an undergraduate research assistant, who helped a lot with getting the slides together and some of the research. And I'm going to start. So my first job, I was very young, I was about 12, was in a public library. And the library was kind of the place I went. I loved being at the library. And as soon as I found it, I was just there all the time. Obviously started off in the children's library, so I have a really soft spot for libraries. So hooray for libraries. It's great to be talking with you in a public library. So, yes, as Dan said, I was excited when I heard about the theme for this year's series, Research in the Public Good. I will talk more about not exactly teaching, a little bit about teaching, but about what we in universities call curriculum, or the kind of set of courses that students take to get through their degree. I'm quite interested in how curriculum, when we get students into these places, we have 4, 5, 6 years, what are we doing? What's happening with that time? It's a lot of time in some ways, and it's time that's quite distinct from other public or private, really, institutions, like what happens in those 4 or 5 years and the opportunity that's there. So I'm going to focus on that. I'll just read the abstract. So I assume all of you have seen this in some form, but I'm going to read it again. That this was the kind of publicity I think that went out, that my lecture, my comments tonight will focus on the purposes of university education as related to the public good. The question of students' capacities following graduation is a timely and relevant issue and under much debate. I will consider multiple views and will also offer a vision that speaks to the world in which we live. So I've been taken up with these questions for quite a long time. I remember university itself as a place to consider big questions. I loved being at university. I guess it was like kind of an extension of the library. And I've been a faculty member teaching anywhere from 2 to 5 classes a year for about 30 years. And here comes the beautiful water. Thank you very much. Here is good. Do you mind? I'm kind of looking over here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I see there's some extra cups if anyone else needs some water. He's been kind enough to think about many of us. So I've been teaching for about 30 years. I started out in the States. I'm from the States. I've been in Canada almost 20 years. I was at the University of Waterloo for about a decade, at a couple institutions in the States before that, did my graduate work in the States. Went from Waterloo to Memorial University in Newfoundland and was there for 4 years. And then from Memorial University, I went to what was then Ryerson University in 2021. I landed I was at Waterloo, I started getting into administration. So I was chair of a department. I then went into a couple of associate dean roles. I went to MUN to be a dean for 4 years in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And then I came to Ryerson University in 2021. I served as the provost for a year. I don't know if these terms are familiar, but it's kind of basically up the hierarchical food chain in universities. They're organized by chair, associate dean, dean, and then provost. And the provost is kind of the academic CEO, you could say, of a university. I served in that role for a year or 15 months, and then I went into a role looking at how do we think about equity in the curriculum. It was especially related to Indigenous issues or content. 2021 was when a report came from a task force with the name change recommendation, which probably many or all of you have heard of. And then there were 20 recommendations, and there were 21 in that report. The name change was just one. So I was named a special advisor to the president to kind of ensure that the recommendation on curriculum was implemented. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially, I'm giving some of this background. I think I've always been thinking about equity and inequity in higher education and public life, and what that has to do with what we're up to at the university. My research has looked at that. I've dealt with it in my teaching, and I have articles and a couple books out from the University of Toronto Press on racism in higher education in North America and in public life, contemporary forms. And then that first strand of my research was race and racism in the classroom and more broadly in higher education universities. And then after that, I started thinking about, okay, now that I've thought through these things about racism and how it works, what's the connection there between what universities owe to public life? And so it was kind of a natural, somewhat new direction, building on the earlier research. So tonight, what I'm going to, there's kind of two big parts to the presentation. You can see I'm very adept with the slides, but I'll get to that in a minute. I do have slides. There's two big parts. I am going to talk about my vision for curriculum and equity and how that would fit in university contexts. And I'll talk about how to implement that, what it looks like in a curricular sense. First, I want to share a bit of how I'm understanding the world. So anytime that a faculty, I'm going to undo this, right. Anytime that a faculty member, any kind of teacher sets up a class at a university, we bring our worldview to that teaching. Some of us talk pretty openly about it, some of us less openly. I'll talk a little bit about what I think that's about or why that matters. But I'm going to talk openly about how I see the world, what I think is going on. Not in fine detail, but because I think that understanding of the world informs my vision, I want to do some background work, and then I'll get into that vision. And now I'm going to see if I can bring the slides up and start the slideshow. Okay, that's I teach, right now I'm full-time faculty, just as of September. Like I said, I was in administration for about 10 years. I guess I'll say why I think that's relevant, because I've been thinking about these issues. Sometimes we say that the faculty or administration are on different sides, and sometimes that's true, and not always. I don't always think about it that way, but so I've been kind of in the faculty role for a long time. I was in a department in that chair role, but I've also served in fairly high-level administrative roles. So the comments I'm offering tonight are not only from being a person in the classroom teaching. I do think this is all doable. I've thought about things very carefully from an administrative or leadership perspective, from a broader perspective. And I think that's significant to bring that experience plus my research and teaching experience into the same pot, I guess. Before I dive into more, let's see, okay, I was told to, no, okay, I'm pushing the wrong button maybe. I think it's the forward arrow. Let's just let go of that. Okay, I'm always curious in these kinds of talks, what I'd like you to just for a couple minutes, right where you're sitting, or you can move to get closer to people. Why did you come tonight? Do you have a particular interest? Are you in university and someone said, hey, you should or have to go to this? Are you attending many of the Rotman lectures? Like, what's going on? What brings you here? What's your stake? Do you have a stake in this topic? Is it kind of purely informational or curiosity? And we'll come back to the big group. I'll be able to hear from some of you, but I want everyone to get some thinking going in yourself on this. So if you could just for a couple minutes, right where you are, turn around, smile, and or you don't have to smile. That was a little unnecessary. But just turn around and kind of think about why you came here. Let the others know. And if you can make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. We're going to come back. I'm going to try to go not more than an hour, and then we'll come back to Q&A. But I'm curious what came up in the conversations. I would love to hear some comments. What came up that folks would like to contribute? Yeah, let's hear it, please, if you want.
I think that the universities are the highest achievement of the human spirit and the human mind.
Okay.
So public good is a little bit ambiguous for me.
Okay.
But the general idea that you're doing something that is human nature and drives humanity, I'm here every time you offer that. So.
Okay, no, great. That's, it kind of helps, it makes me pause because I think for me, we're on this, you see a lot of potential, obviously, then in universities. You said the highest achievement. Those are big words.
That and wine.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. Other comments? Thanks for starting us off.
Different view.
All right. Well, do you want to share?
Oh, sorry. I can. I certainly can.
All right. I think they're asking, if you can use them, great.
So yeah, is this a microphone? What is this? What am I looking at? Do I just, it's just
We're recording, so it's helping them get all of us. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so I come at education from a very different perspective because I'm someone who dropped out of high school, mostly due to social factors. I completed adult learning center equivalency courses to get started at Lambton College. I actually started at Lambton College before I technically finished high school, but that's the thing. I graduated Lambton College with honors, and I went on to York University.
Okay.
I despised university and the university system. I felt it was not a place to learn. I felt it was a place where the ideas were more basic than what I learned in college, where the class sizes were so large that nobody could make any meaningful connection with their professor, where there was this sort of air of arrogance that like if you graduated from college or if you're a tradesman, you're some kind of moron that couldn't get into university.
Right.
That was sort of what I experienced in the university system. I eventually graduated from Humber College. Okay. And now I'm a union carpenter.
Okay.
But nevertheless, I'm still very much interested in the academic world, the intellectual world. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to compare and contrast with a room of people who are probably mostly university educated and someone who's not, someone who did not thrive in that system. So
okay,
that's why I want to.
It has clearly thought about these tensions, this push and pull. So thank you. Yeah, thanks. Anyone else want to? Great. Yeah, let's go.
Hi, I'm a PhD student, and I dream to be a professor one day. This is my passion. I love being in the classroom. I love talking to young people about their ideas. But I also am very for the idea that everything should be discussed, because I believe nowadays the university curricula don't prepare it doesn't prepare the students for a world that we are in right now. It doesn't provide them with the necessary skill sets, I feel like, and it only gives them maybe the profession specific knowledge or the skills, specific skills that they need. Right. But I don't think it gives the necessary skills to exist in a society. Okay. So, and I think that goes through dialogue to actually discussing ideas and openly and having opinions out there openly. Yeah. But I think that freedom is very difficult in the face of the administration.
Yes,
especially like
yes,
what
it's
the
coming to the
professor
fore now.
has in the classroom. Exactly.
Yes.
So that's why I'm here today. I want to
Okay.
like hear more about
Yeah.
like the, I don't know, professor like or the teaching person vis-a-vis
that might
the
look like. Yeah.
administration. Like
Yeah.
exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Maybe one more comment. Like I said, hold on to your. We're going to come back to this. These are all intersecting well. Does anyone else want to jump in? Anyone? Yes, please, Greg.
I'm on the camera. I shouldn't jump in, but I can't help myself. I do care about this in the university.
Yeah.
Like Peter says, there's an aspect of what he's saying being very true. I think it's a very honorable place set aside by society for a very special purpose.
Yeah.
On the other side, though, particularly in our Canadian universities, it's very corporatized.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we're more concerned about budgets and money.
Yeah.
And are you overspending your budget? There's more at administration. You can talk to this. So we become so concerned with that, with tuition fees. A recent visiting professor from Germany visited my class. I teach at the university. And lo and behold, their students don't pay tuition.
Yeah.
Their film students, when they're making their first film,
Yeah.
apply and receive grants between 15 and 25,000 euros
Yeah.
to make the film. So there's some real
Yeah,
support
there's different kind of support.
So are we a bank? Are we a bank where we're more worried about our company or corporation?
Yeah.
Or are we engaged in what Peter was talking about in the higher reasons for the existence of
Yeah.
universities?
Okay. Good questions. All of these are good questions. Okay. Okay. Great. We'll come back to I think most of these things. And hold on, there'll be more time for discussion. Okay, let's see if this works. No, it doesn't like that. Let's see. Oh, okay. We saw something there. There we go. Yeah, it is. It's with me now. All right. So first, I just wanted to draw some attention to, and some of these were reflected in your questions, but it doesn't really matter. Anyone who's looking at the news broadly right now, you're going to see headlines about universities. So who's afraid of academic freedom? This is in University Affairs. Defenders of democratic debate are rising to meet the challenges of ideological polarization, governmental interference, underfunding of academic institutions. Inside the University of Alberta's move away from diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Alberta and some other institutions, but Alberta, the ones that did this most publicly, they moved from equity, diversity, inclusion, and they're now using language access, community, and belonging. So they dropped these terms in favor of it. National strategy for generative AI, and then to one of the questions directly, I think the court bans pro-Palestinian protests at McGill University campus for 10 days. So lots of, the universities are in the news all over the place quite readily. So here, I said I was going to read off the vision, and this may make a lot of sense, it might make no sense, but I'm going to put this out there. Sometimes academics, we save the punchline till the very end, and I've been advised to get it out there. Give them your punchline. Here's the punchline. The central obligation of universities to public life is to contribute to the practices of living together well with attention to equity. So that was an idea I worked out over the course of my second book, and I'll go into this a little bit, but I am going to talk about public life, specifically practices of living together well with attention to equity. I want to say off the bat that this is for all disciplines. I've worked with a lot of departments across different initiatives. I think that's something that nearly all faculty can get on board with, the practices of living together well, that's at least part of what they're thinking about when they are teaching students. And attention to equity. Okay, so what does that mean? For academic programming. Given this, academic programming will ideally strengthen students' capacities to recognize equity and contribute to equity. Okay, so I'm going to back up and say, how do I see the world that I think this is necessary? And then I'm going to get into explaining what I mean by that and how it can work. Okay, that's where I'm going. Okay. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see the world in which we live. Again, I think every professor's got a worldview. some of us don't talk about it, but we have it. We have to think about whenever you design a class, you have a picture of the world that the students are going to go into. I'm going to talk about what do I mean by the public good and the words equity, inequity. I'm going to talk about a vision for universities and public life, and then I'll talk about academic programming. Let's see. All right. So just to give some basic context about universities in Canada, just so we can place them. I can see a typo right there. Sorry about that. So there are about 100 public universities in Canada. The total budget for all of those 100 universities is roughly $47.5 billion. 42% of that budget is federally and provincially funded. Just to get a perspective on that budget, how much that is, because it's hard for me to grasp that. The Ontario provincial budget will be $232 billion. So it's not a small amount, when you compare it to the total Ontario budget. And 33% of Canadians have a university degree, and it's about that percentage of Canadians that are currently enrolled in universities right now. So that it kind of underscores that this is a significant institution in this country. It's not a small thing, universities. Okay, how do I understand the public good? So the public good, I'm just going to read from the slide there. The public good are benefits that accrue when institutions place a higher value on citizen engagement, on quality of life indicators such as healthcare, education, a living wage, and meaningful work, and on the well-being and reduction of suffering among social groups so they place a higher value on all of those things, society, than on privatized market-based profit and individual gain. Okay, that's the kind of the understanding I'm working with on public good. Just some, here's, we're gonna.
The focus of our campaign has been on housing, it's been on childcare, it's been on public transit. And in some senses...
Forgive me for interrupting. So what you're saying is anything that's a necessity, housing, food, education, should not ever be given over to market instability or prices. It has to be there.
I think
it has to be free.
I think that it has to be a fixture in each and every person's life.
I'm assuming.
So I apologize. I didn't. This was a part of an interview I wanted to give these introductory comments in advance. I apologize. Between Zoran Mamdani, who is now the mayor-elect in New York, if you've been following that news, and David Remnick, who's a well-known journalist in the States. So I just heard this recently, and it's interesting because the interviewer interrupts. Remnick says that I can't remember his exact words, but the housing, transportation, what Mamdani says is those needs to be they need to be a fixture in people's lives. And Remnick uses the words, we can't give those over to market forces. And Mamdani says, and I think that's a helpful idea of the public good. Obviously, he's a politician, but I just wanted to situate and give some other voices on what we might think of as the public good. Just some quick examples. Okay, there we go. For examples, the spa, I'll mention that in just a second, is a Toronto-specific example. Libraries, obviously public goods, we're in one of those, very easy to understand. I think bike lanes, another example, they reduce cities' carbon footprint, give transportation options. The name change at Toronto Metropolitan University, I think that is that was a little more complicated. Some people said, maybe you're going to lose money if you do that from donors. But many would say that, and the way the president framed that name change is we want our name to reflect the aspirations of the university as a whole. That's in the direction of the public good. And right now there's no particular reason that you've heard about this, but it's a big deal in Toronto right now. There's 16 acres of publicly accessible parkland right on the lake. And the province just granted a 95-year lease for that 16 acres to a company called Thermospa. I think that's the name. Therm Canada. And so there's been a lot of back and forth about this. Who's going to use this spa? A very small percentage of the population. What about the rest of the folks? So this is a public good issue. It's a complex one. It's still being figured out. It's going to happen. There were a lot of people protesting that this wouldn't happen, but it will happen. But I wanted to give some examples of the kind of where we have the push and pull of the public good. let me get into a definition of justice and equity. I use the word justice here largely because Marion Young, the author, who I quote, uses that word. I'll also say briefly, maybe some of you have studied the kind of evolution of the word justice or equity. For a long time, I looked at some of these topics from that second book I mentioned. For a long time, justice was understood from what we call a rights-based or a distribution-based model. And that's largely in what I would and many others would identify as kind of individual framework. So you think about justice or equity being kind of distributed, kind of given out to individuals. And certainly that's had a lot of adherence. It's offered us a lot of helpful ways to think about justice. Iris Marion Young, this book came out in 1990, she took a definite turn. And she said, I want to think about justice in a more relational sense that takes a kind of more relational sense of power, an institutional sense of power. And that was a really fairly significant turn from previous. And I note that because I think it's important that Young is trying to bring in something different to what had been in place for a really long time. And how Young defines justice, it's an interesting definition, I think. She says it's the degree to which a society supports the institutional conditions necessary for one. So already we see she's anchoring justice in what society supports. So there's at the very outset a social component. She's not starting from the individual. She says conditions necessary for developing and exercising one's capacity and expressing one's experience. Can we express our experience? Does society support that? Can we express our capacities? Does society support that? And then part two is participating in determining one's action and the conditions of one's action. So these are pretty big statements, I find. I also find that they can work, we're in a complicated world, obviously. I find that they can work at all levels. They could work in a family situation where you're trying to sort out at what age does a kid get to do this, They could work with that spa example. So I have found it a fairly robust definition. And I think it's a useful way to understand, and I'll draw on this understanding in later parts of the presentation. So again, if we make some examples of where, and I'm focusing specifically now on where society is supporting the development and exercising, using one's capacities and expressing one's experience, and then participating in determining one's actions. I think a really quick way, for me anyways, to understand the significance of this and what it offers is, in the last 5 years, in the wake of George Floyd, all over the world, attention to police violence, what that can mean for communities. In those examples, those folks who are at the other side of police violence they're very much not determining the conditions of their actions. It's a very kind of plain example. I think this definition has more subtlety than that, but that's one way to kind of make it concrete. Community centers. I live near a community center in Toronto. There's certainly places where people go to exercise their capacities. Again, a pretty straightforward. Toronto Public Libraries, in looking at this, in preparing for tonight, I read that the Toronto Public Libraries, in select libraries, not a lot, they offer mental health support folks, and people in crisis can just show up at the library and get help. That's a place where if you're in a mental health crisis, you can't exercise your capacity. So the library is helping folks get to that spot. If we take a more complicated example where it's not as obvious, I think, the reasons and the responses, we can look at juvenile justice in Canada. So according to the Department of Justice in Canada, in 22-23, Indigenous youth in Canada accounted for 40% of the admissions to provincial and territorial correctional facilities and only 8% of the Canadian youth population. So that's a gap of 32%. We don't even need to agree on the reasons for that gap. I think there are many. I think they're complicated. I'm more interested in how this demonstrates Young's definition. You go into a correctional facility, right off the bat, you're going to have less opportunity to exercise your capacities, express your experience, and determine the conditions of your actions. So that's just an example that illustrates Young's approach to justice. Okay. Let's see, here we go with another interview. So this time I'm going to remember and give you the preface before. So we're going to hear some comments from Joanne Liu. She's interviewed on a program here called Democracy Now! Joanne Liu is a Canadian pediatric emergency medicine physician. She was scheduled to speak at NYU on March 19th, 2025. They had asked her almost a year in advance to give a talk. She's the former international head of Doctors Without Borders, and they canceled her talk. I guess she had sent them some slides, and some of the slides could be viewed as, quote, anti-governmental. And I think the reason I'm playing this quote is because there's a good link between what she's saying about universities and Young's definition of justice. So here we go. Let's see if this, I think it's
I
just...
would like, before we end the show, the reason why I wrote this letter is the fact that I truly and strongly believe that university are the temple of knowledge, but as well of plurality of ideas. And if we do not allow that, we are basically killing the essence of what university is about. It's about having people to be able to express different point of view in a safety environment, where as well students can be exposed to it and make up their mind. That is what is necessary, and that is what makes a university, even a country, stronger by plurality of ideas.
We do have 27.
Okay, so that was the walk through public good and equity. I'm going to now walk fairly quickly through 4 what I call starting points that inform my teaching, the books and the research I've worked on. I think we all have starting points. I'll just briefly say faculty, when we teach or when we develop curriculum, I would say that I'm going to talk about systemic inequity. And I think that teaching that doesn't point to particular outcomes or that to think about these issues may in some ways be supporting what we could call business as usual. So teaching that just kind of goes along with society that it is, that takes it at face value, doesn't really pick up questions of what might be going on in the world, in some ways is kind of supporting what is. It's not that I think that it's a binary that we do either the other. I think a lot of times in my teaching, I'm probably doing some of both. But I think that our ideas about the world and whether or not we're on board with any one of these or none of them or more. So 4 things I'll speak briefly about each one. We are enmeshed, implicated, what we do. We can't be a human being and kind of opt out of any consequentiality or mattering. What we do matters. Systemic inequity exists, power matters, and we need a language and imagination for the public good. So let me just briefly expand on these a little bit. Dewey was an educator, John Dewey, in the early 1900s. He said, we're associated individuals. We're a we. We live together. We're always enmeshed. Our choices have consequences. Where we shop, what we bring to our jobs, what we do with our free time, all of these things have consequences. Right. Another writer, not quite as early as Dewey, but I guess about 50, 60 years ago, politics involves genuine relationships with people who are genuinely other people, not tasks set for our redemption or objects for our philanthropy. So this is an orientation. I'm not trying to mandate a way to think, but I think if we're oriented towards the world in this way, if we see all of our choices as being about a we rather than an I, that's in line with how I'm seeing the world and how this is what's informing the vision I'm going to come back to. Second point, kind of starting point, is systemic inequity exists. I'm going to show some statistics to make some examples. This is a complicated topic. We can have a plurality of ideas about why systemic inequity exists. We don't have to all think the same about that. I'm not rigid, but I guess a belief that this statement stands in Canada right now is important to how I'm seeing the world. So just here's some broad examples from Canada. Black students are 4 times as likely to be expelled from a Toronto high school than white students. If we look at the top 100 Canadian publicly traded companies, 523 named execs, like in the senior positions, only 12% are women. Within that 12%, only 10% of that 12% are visible minorities. So across gender and race, we have clear discrepancies. And then the government's Indigenous Services pages list active long-term drinking water advisories across several First Nations. These are all, for me, examples of systemic inequity, and I'll say a little bit more about that concept. Here's some global statistics. If we look at global wealth distribution, some of this might be well known, but I think it's, again, it's a starting point. So I want to fill that in a little bit. Top 1% of the population earns about 46% of the wealth, or earns is probably not the best word, has about 46% of the wealth. Top 2 to 10%, 44%. The bottom 90% of the population has 10% of the wealth. So these are quite stark statistics. If we look at global access to safely managed drinking water, again, kind of a loose link to Young's definition of justice in terms of developing, how society supports developing capacities. If you don't have safe drinking water, so Canada is amidst some countries that are very, very high. 99% of people have access to safely managed drinking water. But you can see in this different countries, it goes down to Uganda has only 18% of its people. So again, these are complicated connections, but they're also realities in the world in which we live. I just want to touch for a minute, because this is a really complicated concept or idea, I think, many ways of understanding it. So individual bias is often, we think, or we talk about it, is about people's attitudes. Institutional inequity is when there's specific organizational rules that promote inequity. And systemic inequity is when entire systems interact to maintain inequality. Usually these are all working. I'm just trying to delineate kind of what I mean by systemic inequity. Okay. All right, power matters is the third point. In short term, power is the ability to make decisions about people's lives and access to resources. It's a quick definition of power. The capacity to define reality, allocate resources, and structure possibilities, often without appearing as such. Examples, I'm not going to take the time, I could in the questions, but examples are the name change was certainly an example when the university could define, they had to allocate resources for that name change to happen. Other examples are in the States, if you're paying attention, they're taking away people's food stamps to just get basic food. Millions of people are losing those kind of vouchers. Social media has a lot of power for different reasons. Service providers, any organization providing services. And the last starting point that I'm thinking about as necessary is on a language and an imagination for the public good and for equity, as a kind of precursor to any healthy democratic society. So, okay.
People always think of education as sort of a transactional transmission of knowledge, which is one important piece of it, but it is actually so much more than that. Learning to live with other people, learning to know yourself, and developing the flexible competencies to be able to navigate a world of uncertainty. Those are kind of the whys for me. But, I might ask you, what are your hopes and dreams for?
So that, we're going to hear a second clip from her, Rebecca Winthrop. She's a senior fellow at the, and director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. And her research focuses on education globally. I think her comments kind of line up with this orientation to how we think about education. She's being interviewed in both of these clips by Ezra Klein, who works for the New York Times. So I hope I'm going to hit the button and we're going to hear a different clip.
Over time, but it has to be an experience where you reflect, you think about meaning, you think about different perspectives, and it changes how you see the world.
But what do you think?
Okay. So that was the kind of background. I'm now going to go back to the vision that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to break this down, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So the central obligation of universities to public life is to contribute to the practices of living together well with attention to equity. Given this, academic programming will ideally strengthen students' capacities to recognize inequity and contribute to equity. So the first thing I want to get into when we think about academic programming and what it should do, I'm going to post here 3 different mission statements. How do universities state their commitment to any of this? If they have a commitment to this, if they don't. University of Western Ontario seeks to provide an environment of free and creative inquiry within which critical thinking, humane values, and practical skills are cultivated and sustained. By pursuing these objectives, the university endeavors to serve the interests of society. So this is directly from Western. The middle one is from the UBC, University of British Columbia. I'll comment on these in just a minute. Inspiring people, ideas, and actions for a better world. And then the University of Toronto, dedicated to fostering an academic community in which the learning and scholarship of every member may flourish with vigilant protection for individual human rights and a resolute commitment to the principles of equality, equal opportunity, equity, and justice. So two things I'll note. It's interesting, I think, to see that Toronto U of T uses the word principles, the commitment to the principles, not the practice, not actions, to principles, which is worth noting. UBC says actions. In my earlier slide, I talk about the practices of living together well. That's an intentional world. It's not ideas about, I'm not satisfied with awareness. It's not good enough. It doesn't do the job. It's necessary to do the job, but it doesn't get us over necessarily closer to equity. And then Western talks about by pursuing these objectives. So practical skills, it's kind of a doing, I think, in Western. A second comment that I'll make is that, and it's very, very common, we see in Western interests of society and then better world. Across North America, almost all, and I was looking into this, well, for my second book, and since then, the thing is, that's easy to agree with. Who can disagree with interests of society? But what they never get into is what happens when the interests conflict. There's very few things that we can do that matter that's just going to be better for everyone all the time in the same way, right? We're a society where we have different interests, there's different things at stake, there's different amounts of power. So I find if you try to look at, well, what is a better world? You know? So in my book I write, well, is a better world? Is it however many versions of the iPhone? I don't know where we're at right now. But that is better, but it's better in a very specific way. If you contrast that to laws or policies around what's called a living wage, that's also better, right? Are those going to come into conflict sometimes? Yes, they will. So who decides? So I think this language, whether or not it's intentional, doesn't really matter. It doesn't get us very far when we have conflict or when there's different interests. And you know, the other thing is, the interests don't even need to be in conflict. We don't need to be fighting necessarily. A democracy is supposed to thrive because of a pluralism of ideas and interests. So that's supposed to be the starting point. So these aren't particularly useful in the real world, I guess is what I would say, in a practical sense. Okay, so that's the first thing where we're not served particularly well by the mission statements of our universities in some ways when we think about academic programming and equity. So the next question I'll work through a little bit and talk about the research is the purposes. What are the purposes of an education, a graduate and undergraduate education? What is that supposed to be doing? So you'll see some of the main purposes are in these statements. The false binary in higher ed. Liberal education and career training are not mutually exclusive. Canadians need universities and so will their next government. Higher education is the missing piece in Canada's economic strategy. That's from a Canadian publication. The one on the left is from a US magazine. Education is not about job training, no matter what Doug Ford wants you to believe. And calibrating the narratives on the purposes of higher education. So all of these are pointing to the importance of purposes. The three main purposes of higher ed over the last couple hundred years in the research, three things. Whole person, the development of the whole human being, lifelong learning, the individual student. Labor market, prepare students to enter the labor market and support the labor market. Civic society, civic engagement, feeling connected to a democracy. I think those are the three main areas. You can look at it this way as well. So here's some quotes. Martha Nussbaum, I think she's a philosopher as well. Students who are reflective, socially responsible, and fully developed human beings. That's what she's calling for. Steve Orsini, President and CEO of Council of Ontario Universities, a very active and important body in Ontario for universities. What matters most is getting our economy and our people ready for the jobs of the future. And then civic society. This is taken from a teaching and learning site at Western, where the university here lays it out. So we're looking for students who are educated and engaged citizens to strengthen democratic values, address critical societal issues, and contribute to the public good. So these are the three main purposes. What is most interesting about the exploration and defense of these three is they're rarely integrated, and they're often put at odds. And there's very little literature that says, why don't we think about these three things as integrated? The other thing that's quite noticeable is, at least when I started thinking about this for me as a faculty member, when I go into the classroom, I'm not thinking, okay, one day I'm going to do civic society and the next hour I'll do the whole human being. You know, I teach to all three in an integrated way. I don't think they need to be at core oppositional. I'm not trying to smooth over that they can be oppositional, but for example, I've commonly or frequently taught a class on persuasion. You know, I want students to learn audience analysis, to learn how to evaluate media, to learn how to think about communication strategically. That's going to serve all three of these things. And I'm not worried about that. That's fine. But to a certain degree, these have been understood as quite discrete and even in competition. Do I want to say any more about that? I'm just going to find my phone. There it is to check time. Okay. I think I'm going to leave. Let me just see if I want to say. Yeah, I will say, I think there's a large discussion on the purposes, on what happens in the classroom, around what we're educating students for. There's a large discussion both in the news and among researchers in this field. And there's been people probably for 50 years who have argued vehemently that education needs to be neutral. Lots of folks have contributed to that kind of thinking. And then there's been pretty extensive criticism of any faculty member like myself who says, no, I think that education leads somewhere. And I guess I can certainly speak in more depth to that. But I said a little bit about this earlier, that when we teach something in a classroom, you're setting up what students can imagine, what they think is possible, what they think is real, what they think is not real. A teacher has a lot of power over that. We don't determine it, but simply by what we put in the curriculum, in the syllabus, in the readings, we start to set out a world, how we see it, what we think it's like. That's furthering some kind of idea, some kind of notion. And I think it's impossible not to do that. So one of the 4 starting points was that we're engaged or we're implicated. In some ways, it's the same as a faculty member. We're starting to lay out a certain way forward within the discipline. And so I think it's impossible to be neutral in that sense. Okay. So I think we can kind of accept reality as it is. We can push back against it, or we can do both. I don't think it's the same for different disciplines, but I think it's in very few cases where a discipline's got absolutely no connection to public life in any way, shape, or form. Okay, let's see. All right. Okay, I'm going to talk just a little bit about this recommendation 9 and I'm going to talk now specifically about academic programming. So I spoke about this earlier. We can integrate purposes, and I want to affirm that I use the word consequentiality. It's kind of a hard word to pronounce, but I like that word, that everything we do matters in the classroom in some way. It all has consequences for our students and what they can imagine in their professions, in their worlds, for themselves, for their futures. Okay, so again, academic programming will ideally strengthen students' capacities to recognize equity and contribute to equity. So I think I talk in some of my writing about to make change, we have to name what's going on and then imagine a different way forward. So if we think about what's informing academic disciplines and programming right now, it's largely 2 things. For all departments, it's going to be what we could loosely call disciplinary norms. Those are norms that are shaped anywhere from 20, 30 to 200 years in a discipline over time. They're concepts, they're ideas, they're theories about that field, and they're developed very rigorously in some ways through scholarship and peer review and study. And then they come to shape the discipline and inform. So in most university departments, the faculty are going to be drawing on, not rigidly or exclusively, but drawing on those disciplinary norms. There's some faculties and departments that are drawing on what we call professional or accreditation norms. Those are lanes in which areas of study, accounting, nursing, areas in medicine or law, some engineering areas are approved. That program is kind of approved by a professional body out in the world. And that's also going to be very significant in shaping what goes into curriculum. So the disciplinary and professional norms. I think with those 4 starting points, I think what we might start to think about is how could we have what we might call public-facing or equity-serving inputs? And why couldn't they interact with the other 2? Why couldn't we see 3 inputs for what our curriculum leads to? And I'm going to talk about this through a concrete example, and then I'll kind of come back to the basic idea and wrap up. So, as I said, I think as I was introduced, I was the chair of the renaming task force, and that was a great thing to be a part of. And then when my role in that process was finished, I was appointed to ensure that Recommendation 9 was implemented. And Recommendation 9, it's printed up here, all academic programs at Toronto Metropolitan University include mandatory learning about Indigenous history and Indigenous and colonial relations for all students. So this was said to all programs at TMU, you have to have Indigenous content. So what happened as a result? This is going on across Canada. In most universities, it's a kind of one-size-fits-all. So either the university might develop one course that every single student takes, or independent faculties, areas of study might develop a course that the students take. That was not, so in this role that I served in for 3 years, the first year was just to get a sense of what did faculty and others at TMU want. They did not want a one-size-fit-all approach. This came from nearly all cohorts of faculty, including I met with the Indigenous faculty as well. And it's interesting because about 3 years ago, I attended a conference in Toronto where it was an Indigenous Studies conference, and there were many presentations on this one-size-fits-all approach. And there's just challenges across the board with that approach from all kinds of angles. So I think I'm using this as an example because some departments are already trying to do this, and some departments come right out of the gate and say, there's no way, we can't do this. Our curriculum's full, we can't fit it, right? And often what happens, because this is a recommendation, the Board of Governors approved it. Departments, they don't have to technically do this because there's faculties have some independence. It's actually the faculties that control the curriculum, but there's a lot of pressure to do this, is what I would say. And a lot of goodwill. A lot of people want to do this, regardless of department. But what happens most often is that a class would get added, like one class, an undergraduate typically takes 40 classes to graduate. So a class gets added. You'll take this one course. Or it gets fitted into an existing course. So for example, there's a course on business ethics at most business programs. You make 1 week of that course on Indigenous reality, right? So here we have an effort that's clearly aligned with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, the TRC. Many universities have said we should do this in some way, shape, or fashion. And then what we do largely is make it an add-on, right? So students are wise, as they should be, as we like. They know, they can recognize when they're given a course that's kind of understood by the university as extra to the rest of their curriculum, right? So this is called, what's called an additive approach. This is what's called an additive approach. And I think, like I said, so I had to work with departments. I went around and worked with all the associate deans, education at TMU and talked about this. And as I said, many told me flat out, we can't do this or it's going to be really hard. We have to start with the additive approach. That's the only place we can start. And my response to that was, okay, good, let's start there because it's somewhere, right? But what I realized probably 10 or 15 years ago, because I've been working on this for a long time, I was the one teaching the courses with some attention. I teach in communication to the world that students would go into in terms of equity and inequity. And students would come to me and say, we're addressing this in this class, but in all my other classes, they're saying that none of that matters. None of the stuff about the real world. It doesn't matter. So what's going on? Because you're saying something different from my other teachers. So then I stopped focusing so much on my classes and I said, oh my God, what about the other 35? And that was kind of a moment for me because until then I'd really been focused on, we call it getting tenure and just surviving my own classes. But then I started to think about the bigger picture and what this might mean in a wider frame. And the additive approach, if we only focus on the additive approach, we're going to be asking these same questions in 50 years because students will see this as extra. There's plenty of pedagogical research across all fields that says for students to really learn something, for them to take it on, it has to be integrated. We can't just slice it off and hope that they put it together with the rest of their material. Okay? So I think this is a way we could think about the outcomes, what students learn in the course of a degree. We could think about, in the Venn diagram, in that very middle piece, if we can see where those overlap. I believe, and I've served in multiple administrative roles, I believe that that's possible. I don't think it's quick or easy. Many of you will know, if you're connected to a university, that we already have some structures for course review and curriculum review. I don't think this is going to be difficult. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's possible. And I think it's, given the world we're in, I think it's a responsive way to think about curriculum and what it might be doing. I'll also note, if you're familiar with that Council of Ontario Universities, they work on a thing that's relevant, or not it's stronger than relevant, applicable to all universities in Ontario. And they're beginning to think about what they're calling an equity outcome. And there's been a subcommittee on that outcome for 2 or 3 years now. And I think eventually that's going to make its way into, some of you might know the term OODLES, on the provincial outcomes list. Okay, so in a sense, I'm going to wrap up now. I talked about the 3 purposes that are very supported in the research: whole human being, civic society, labor market. I think we can bring those together. I don't think those need to be in competition. And I think we can bring, when we think about the disciplinary, the ideas, not so much what the education's for, but what's informing what a student learns. I think we could bring these 3 things in. I think given the world we're in, this is an appropriate response for universities. And I think it's doable across programs. It must be collective. It can't be done by one faculty member. So when I teach, I often ask students, how are you a consumer? How are you a citizen? How do you think about the public good? What does it mean? They often start with they often can make the consumer list much longer than the citizen list. They're very quick. Sometimes I'll have students say, does spending money count as being a citizen? I'll say, well, maybe we can try for another answer. And I'm not blaming them for that. There's a reason that that's a hard thing to answer, right? And then we can talk about what is the future that we want to inhabit. And I think that's not only a good question for students, but I think it's a good question for universities, because we have 4 to 6 years with students. I also think universities are one of the highest, most important places for things to happen in these areas. And so I think this is a good question for universities and faculty to be asking. So I really appreciate the time tonight to bring you into this vision, break it down a little bit, and have you listen to what I'm excited about. So thanks very much for coming. Yeah. And I'm glad to take questions. Comments, questions, yes, or I don't have any. I guess we just need to, there's no formality to this. Dan, is that fine? Okay.
So I was thinking, I think that one of the most inequitable areas, or industries, would be the academic journal publishing industry with the triple pay system, where it's just like, for those that don't know, it's the taxpayers or students pay us to do the research, and then we peer review the research for free for the academic journals, and then we have to pay to get our own research back. And then it actually prevents even the public from accessing it because it costs $50. So the libraries end up needing to spend like hundreds of thousands of dollars to make these deals with academic journal publishers. I was wondering, in what ways can we see universities in the future move away from such like almost a ridiculous system that is, in my opinion, unnecessary. And I think that a lot of like other individuals that are research librarians think that it's kind of corrupt in how the entire system operates.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll answer it briefly because I think it has a connection. It's not the primary focus or what I've been working on. I guess I'll say a couple things briefly though. Yes, you're right that there's some challenge, as you're pointing out, there's some definite challenges to that. I do think that, I finished my PhD in '97, so I think there's been some changes. I've sat on committees that review the promotion and tenure guidelines, so there's not as much weight, or there's weight put on a wider range of things to get tenure. This is going to be different in different departments. So I also will affirm, though, that I think there's some value to the peer review and the rigor in professionalizing. Like I have some stock. For me, it's a pro-intellectualism to say that we have to have some of that. I don't think it needs to be exclusive. There should be a variety of ways of evaluating our colleagues. So I really, to be honest, I just don't have a direct answer to that question. I don't know if I'm just pausing if I want to say any more. I've been I've been a faculty member, like I said, and an administrator, and there certainly are a lot of things wrong with universities from an administrative perspective. And as you acknowledged in your question, a lot of these prices and pricing are set by things outside of the institution, and they have to decide, what are we going to pay for this year? So, when I'm teaching and thinking about strategy, I always think, who are the decision makers? That's how you have to who you have to convince. But I guess I'll say that I guess as a faculty member at a university, I can see a lot wrong. But I'm always thinking about my sphere of influence. What can I influence? What can I do something about? And I think even with these complications, I don't know what role you have. I certainly am in a privileged role. I have tenure. I'm a full professor. A lot of privileges come with that. But what can I do with those privileges to make a dent in this inequity? Yeah, that's my response. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Other questions?
Do you have an example of a scholar that touched you when you were in your PhD or some point? Someone who lived this practically?
Yeah, lived the inequity at a university.
Live the ideals that you're.
Live the ideals. Okay, yeah, that's a different question.
Other than John Dewey.
Yeah, other than John Dewey. No, you're right. Thank you. I don't want to leave everyone thinking that John Dewey was my hero. Yeah. So I have, I guess, two responses. So it's a little bit of a personal story, but someone asked me earlier today if I've been to this. So I'm from the States. I think I said that, been in Canada almost 20 years. But I just went out to the 80th birthday party of my master's and doctoral supervisor. And I think she's kind of a hero. I don't know if she'd like that word. We're close friends. And I'm going to tell a quick story. It gives some insight, I guess, into why I'm thinking about all these things. And then I have a part two. A more professional answer, I guess, or more, is anyone doing this stuff right now? So Dr. Toinette Eugene is her name. Anyways, I started thinking about race and racism as a master's student. I hadn't thought about it much before. I'm white. And I was hanging out with a group of people, and one of those people made a racist comment. My Toinette Eugene, Dr. Eugene, my advisor, is a black woman. And someone made a racist comment, and I was studying about race and white privilege, and I didn't say anything. We were just hanging out one night. I didn't say anything. And then I was in a PhD seminar where we had an opportunity I was able to write about that event in a paper for this one PhD class. So I thought, hey, I'm going to do that because I want to explore what happened there. Like I could not get my head around, I didn't feel good about myself that I was studying race, as this great graduate student. I was at Northwestern, and yet someone makes a racist comment and I say nothing. And then I realized, oh my gosh, it was at a time where I was at, there were very few black women faculty. So the minute I wrote about this in this class, people would know. The professor would know. If I talked about it, people would know who she was. I thought I can't write about this then without talking to her. So I thought, okay, here we go. So I went to her office one day and I said I was hanging out with friends and this happened and I didn't say anything. And I wanted to tell you because I'm going to try to write a paper about it and explore what was going on. And there was a pause and she said to me, Jennifer, what you're learning is that racism is not a theory. And it just, first, there was such grace in that comment. I just was floored. I was scary to go and talk to this black woman who I was in my PhD at this point, and she was my master's supervisor as well. I'd known her for a long time, and yeah, and so that also opened a whole nother area in my intellectual life that I didn't want to be a white person just walking around in my head thinking about race and racism. It wasn't going to be enough. And then I started thinking about how just approaching teaching from my head, like a disembodied head, in talking about social issues might not be enough either. So that's maybe a bit of a long story, but I appreciate the question, and some of that is where this began. So, and I'll answer from the perspective of leadership in higher education right now in North America. I'm I'm optimistic about these ideas. Like I've stuck to them, and I'm hopeful, and I hope I can find others to be in conversation with. That's why it was great to be asked. I think that right now, in this moment, it's difficult. We don't see a lot of administrators who are even open to these discussions in Canada. I'm not super optimistic right now about that. Certainly it's happening in the States, and there's clear, direct, visible punishments in the States. And Canada seems to be in many places, at many universities, it's quiet, but if you've served in the roles as dean, you can see where they're backing off from commitments to equity day by day by day. And what's the line? There's a line that a columnist in the States took from Snyder, the guy who went to the U of T from Yale or whatever, about something being, is it acquiescence precedes autocracy or something? I think Canadian universities are acquiescing when we don't need to, around higher levels of leadership, because I've been in those places and understand how that works. So that's like a part two, that I think if we're honest, I do think as a person who's close to equity and probably will think about it in depth for the rest of my career, that even more important to keep the language on the table. You know, these are the moments when we lose the language to talk about what matters. So I find it's critical to keep the language on the table. That's
more the U.S. situation. There's so much polarization. A small group could push the needle very easily. That's one of the things that I've been hearing in Canada at various public forums.
Yeah.
And where scientists or doctors, Tim Caulfield was here recently, and he said, you've got to try to, people in the sciences and medicine, got to try to find a consensus. You've got to start talking to each other because a polarization of any group like medical or science can be an opportunity for
it's an opportunity to jump in and
and push the dial in a way that nobody really wants.
I think collective. Gesson talks a lot about this columnist collective, and we were just talking earlier today as well about the ways in which faculties are in departments are not very collective anymore. Not even doing collective action, but just talking together. And so I think the more we can return to that, it's going to help. Yes, you have a question. Sorry,
we got a speaking thingy. Okay. Because I got a few notes.
Sure.
So first off, I want to say I really enjoyed this. It's got the gears turning in my head a lot.
Okay, thank you.
And it's, I like what you're presenting in terms of your ideas for the future. I do. But one thing that I sort of want to start with, and I say this not as a critique of what you just presented, but as a thought of the system on the whole.
Sure.
I challenge that universities are entrenching systemic inequalities as opposed to resolving them.
Okay.
There's an adage on job sites as someone who works in construction that engineers and architects are the dumbest people on the job site. And the reason that people say that is because they tend to have no accountability. They're often Thank you. They're often rude and condescending to tradespeople, and they're not available when we need to contact them. They act like they're better than everyone else. They drive away in their Lexus at 3:00 in the afternoon when we stay till 7, right? So there's that. But I also have sort of observed that universities on the whole, the way they teach business and economics is aggressively capitalist, is aggressively right wing.
Okay.
When I talk to people who have been tangentially, connected to Western in particular, the people who are in those programs are frequently typified as being, aggressively right wing.
Yeah.
And the way that economics is being taught is a model of economics that keeps a great wealth disparity between people. Yeah. It's not a model of economics designed to lift up. It's a model of economics to keep the rich rich.
Okay.
So if universities are continuing to protect that system, are they then not driving that same inequality?
Yeah.
And I guess the other part that I wanted to bring is 33% of Canadians are university grads and students, but I'm curious to know what the breakdown of their economic background would be, because when I do service work at university dorms or the apartment buildings built for students, I see really, really wealthy kids.
Yeah.
I don't see kids that appear to be from the
working
same
class
background that I am from.
Yes.
And there was a segment you did on the purposes of higher education. I would argue that the purpose of higher education differs greatly depending on where you were born. If you were born into poverty, it's almost certainly going to be to get a job.
Yeah, from the student, from the student perspective, what they're going for.
100%.
Yes.
So a lot of those, if you're coming from poverty, you're probably not going to get an opportunity to explore yourself intellectually. You're not going to have an opportunity to necessarily engage with civic things. But I would offer as well, as someone who did grow up in poverty and didn't go through university, I have made an active effort in my life to integrate those things.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So there's ways that we do it without university that
Yes.
I feel that by university looking out, they can also learn. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So that was a lot. I apologize.
No,
Thank
it's
you
okay.
for your,
I can see I love it. Like, as you said, you're thinking about it, and that's really clear. So that's great. I guess, I don't think there were any specific questions in there, but that's okay. I'm not criticizing. I'm just checking in. It's okay.
I guess the question is the primary question there was sort of, the primary question there was sort of how can universities realistically challenge systemic inequality when the models of economics being taught in university and economy is really what dictates most of Canadian society right now.
It's certainly.
If that model is not equitable and universities are protecting and teaching that model, then how can equality be ever achieved?
In trouble. That's an excellent question, and your comments were great. It's complicated, like you said, and I appreciate you bringing attention to, in many of these comments, I'm talking about universities broadly and kind of where we're headed as a collective unit. But you're right, and you're right, students come in for vastly different reasons, and that matters to their education. I want to affirm that. So let me answer, that's a great question, and it gives me a minute to kind of explain why I think this can work. You're exactly right, I do think that's the case, and I'm not a fan of sweeping generalizations. So I'm going to make comments about business departments here, but in any department, there's a variety of political perspectives, there's a variety of intellectual perspectives, and then, in fact, that's what we want. So I'm not trying to oversimplify or typify what goes on in different departments. But yes, in certain departments, like where there's explicit direct teaching of economics, it will often be in a capitalist model, right? So, I've been in different leadership roles, and when you lead faculty, you don't get to fire people. I know I'm not meaning it to be a joke, but when you're in industry or a business, you have a very clear kind of leverage, right? And when you're a leader of faculty, you do not have that leverage. So starting as chair, if I've always been in these roles to make some change, to move from A to B, and you don't have leverage. You don't have the normal leverage. You don't get to say, I don't like your performance, I'll see you later. You have to figure out, so I started thinking of leadership as a shared interest model. Where do we have some shared interests? Because maybe if I can identify the shared interests, they'll show up because their interests are on the table, right? And so I think for me, that practices of living together well, I thought about that. It took me a long time to come up with that statement when I really had to think about and be able to say in a short phrase, what is it that universities are doing? And so then I started talking when I was in this role and in different roles really, where I was talking with people across the university about why they're a faculty member, what they're trying to do with their students. And I would say that my approach to leadership in those different roles, chair and then dean and provost and the special advisor, is to invite people in, right? So yeah, I might not like a business professor who's teaching an ethics class and doesn't, whatever. Maybe they just don't talk about whatever. Like maybe that's not kind of my favorite content or perspective that they're putting out. But as a leader, so for example, as a chair of a department or as a dean of a faculty, I can bring a group together and say, what would it mean for this department to think about the practices of living together well? It's going to be new. I'm not a fool. Like that question. So when I start talking about this with people, like I remember I was at an event at TMU and there was a guy from engineering and I can never remember if this is my ignorance, and it's funny, but it's not, but he's a nice guy, so he probably doesn't care. But I can never remember if he works in cement or concrete. Like that's his whole research area. And so I thought, if I could talk to this guy so I asked him, like, why did you go into teaching when you thought about working with students? He got so excited about what they were going to do with cement and concrete in the real world, so I think that, I guess my response to faculty who are on a different track, I'm going to approach any faculty with the assumption that they might be willing to consider what their impact on students is and when they send them out in the world. And I'm not going to, maybe they're going to keep teaching some of that capitalist stuff. I'm not a purist. Like, why am I going to try to rip the rug? Like, that's their business. We have some independence as faculty. I like mine too. But I guess I've been at enough tables in enough situations and, I've learned how to lead with that shared interest approach and to invite people in. And it's interesting when you can find a question that a department as a whole can engage in, because they can get very, very excited if they start to see, oh, we're talking to each other and I actually care what we're talking about because it's going to affect the students that we're educating in this department. So that's maybe a bit around the corner, but I do believe in it. I don't think it's just a nice idea.
I was just reflecting on the questions being asked, and there is a strange thing about how the mission statements all talk about the public good, but the universities and the publishers are run on a capitalist model. And does that ever get talked about?
No. So it's interesting because when I started out as chair at Waterloo, all these questions were like running in my mind, because I'd been working on equity and I was new enough. So the first year I kept saying every question was prefaced with, I'm new here. Can we talk about this and this? Because the chairs have meetings like every month. So I was immediately, I was in a faculty with 15 departments. Some faculties have like 5 departments. So when you're in a faculty, and at MUN, I was dean of 15 different departments. When you're in a faculty with 15 departments, it's kind of like 15 chairs coming to you and say, can I have half the money and you can give the rest of it to the other, and that's what you're dealing with. That's a bit exaggerated, but every day. So I started thinking about when I was chair and then associate dean and provost, the short answer is that it is possible to lead universities putting the academic purpose in front and then within the academic purpose situating the budget. Like I had the largest budget deficit at MUN, and they basically said, we're not going to give you any more faculty hires until you solve that budget deficit. So guess what? I figured out how to solve the budget deficit. So, and even as provost in that 15 months, I could think about it. So there are ways to put the academic mission in front and figure out the budget within that. I can talk about, like I've been at many, many tables. It's not the inclination of what people do. I think many leaders, like deans, they run their programs so there's competition. So like the chairs think, I have to go off the biggest piece because this is not a shared process here. It doesn't have to be approached that way, but it's not talked about really. No, I think there's very few deans or provosts who would use that language that I just used to say, we're an academic institution. We're going to put that first. The budget will serve that mission rather than the other way around. And there are ways to do that. I've overseen large budgets. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Can
Yeah.
I'll ask a question. So, this may be unfair because we're talking about universities and higher education.
Yeah.
But I think everything that you're saying is applicable to education from kindergarten levels.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is like, is it too late at the university level to start implementing that vision when we talk about economic disparity and access to those means of education? Whereas like should we be aiming to do this equity work so that kids at an early level are getting this?
Yeah, it'd be lovely if we. I think these questions of what's education for a 5-year-old, for a 10-year-old, for a 25, at each stage. Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No. I mean, so I was just curious, like, if you've had conversations with people in those different educational spheres, and like, just if you have thoughts on maybe the broader vision of that, and how.
Yeah, so I do. I had a very specific research. I was the lead on a research project where we made 2 films about racism and colonialism in Canada, and one of the films was made in Saskatchewan with the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, and with an Indigenous scholar named Verna St. Dennis, who's now emerita at University of Saskatchewan, professor emerita, and we produced a film that won an award. It's a 30-minute film, and that whole film, it's about colonialism in the education system in Saskatchewan. The whole film is asking, what do we want schools to do with our kids? And one of the things the film says is that in Indigenous communities, part of what schools do is teach us what it means to be a human in relationship, where we are. And I'm not saying that's the only thing, but I do think that film is kind of a good step toward opening up that question. And it links it to how forms of colonial education shut that down and how it leaves no room for people to think about what it means to be a human in community. So I think I don't have experience with formal schooling, but I guess that film was, just it was a privilege to be involved with that. It was a long time in the making because we worked so closely with the Indigenous community there and this Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. But I do think that film, I feel good about that film as a kind of an example of a response to that question. Yeah. I'm looking at you three like I've just been curious the whole time why you guys are here and what you're thinking. But as I teach, you can say pass. You don't have to say anything. But are you guys here because of a class or what's? Okay. Oh. Extra marks, cool. Okay. What do you have to do to get the extra marks? Let's make sure you got what you need. What's that? Okay. And you're going to tell me now what you're going to say, right? What are you going to say about? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, does one of you sorry, we got some competing. Yeah, but we're okay, right, Tanner? Yeah, we're a different room. So we're at 8:30, right? But can you kind of, any thought from 1 or 2 or 3 of you? I'm just curious because you've been quiet and I feel you've been attentive. And what are thoughts going on? Really, anything? Yeah, do you mind using the mic? Yeah. Thank you.
I don't think any of us really knew anything about it going into it, so I think it's been a lot
informative.
Really
it's been a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And is it like surprising, weird, just all new? Anything else?
Kind of all new.
Yeah. Okay. What's the class?
I'm in CYS. It's crime.
Oh, it's crime.
It's about youth and stuff. So when you're talking about the Indigenous overrepresentation.
Oh yeah, the juvenile justice.
We talk about that a lot. So it's kind of cool to hear.
Okay. Well. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for letting me know. Yeah. You two? Nothing? You got nothing?
Not in the class.
Oh, you're not. Okay. Well, we're laughing, so I think we gave you a little fun, right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. If there's no other questions, I guess we can. Do you have formal? Yeah.
Thank you so
much.
I
Dan, let me just say thanks for. Sorry, I should have.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for coming out and participating. It was great. I had a good night, so I really appreciate everyone coming, and of course Dan and your colleagues for inviting me.
I appreciate you all too. Thanks everybody for coming out, and big thanks to London Public Library.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.